afternoon. And welcome to this celebration of our sanctuary's 200th anniversary and our faith community of 350 years. My name is Tom Sartain. I'm an elder at this church. I've been a member for almost 40 years, and I'm honored to be here talking to you today. When we say 200 years, it's easy to trace back 2025 to 1825, when this building that you're sitting in now was constructed. So the pews you're sitting on and what you see around the church, the sanctuary, is what was here in 1825. The gates on the pews were put there on purpose because there was no heating back then. And to cut down on the draft, they put the gates there. The women would bring in their foot warming coal case, put down in the pew to keep themselves warm, just as they did back when the church or the meeting house was at its original site down at River Road and Moriches Road. The men at that time were able to bring in their hunting dogs to sit at their feet to keep their feet warm. We don't really accept that anymore. As I begin my talk today, I'd like to invite you to do two things. One is to be quiet and listen to our church bell being rung. Back in the day, the meeting houses or the churches would have a bell, and the bell would ring to announce worship service, other meetings, and also fire alarm. We no longer have that, but we still have the bell, which was installed in 1850. We have a mechanical device that rings the bell on the hour. It's under repair right now, but we still have the ability to pull the bell rope, and we'll have a demonstration of that now by my son-in-law, John Bliss. You can imagine 1825, well actually 1850 when that bell was installed, what it sounded like to the community. It was a beacon to the community back then, just as the presence of this meeting house, this church, has been an iconic place in the history of Smithtown, at the intersection of what we call sometimes the love of God and the love of neighbor. This year we're celebrating the 200th anniversary of the sanctuary and the 350th anniversary of our faith community. But to say that too glibly, 1825 to 2025, that's 200 years. Well, a lot happened in this country, in this community in those 200 years. And even more so when we say it's the 350th anniversary of us being a faith community here. 350 years. 1675, when the first church was established by Richard Smith. 1675, 1775, 100 years later, the American Revolution's going on. From 1775 to 1825. What happened then? It's getting ready for the Civil War. From 1825 to 1925. The first man has landed on the moon. When you think of that expanse of history, one thing is common. There was a faith community of what became the Presbyterian Church, and we can rightly call that our ancestor. We are descendants from that early church in 1675. Our story of Richard Smith founding Smithtown actually starts in 1620. 1620, if you remember, the Pilgrims landed at Plymouth Rock. And 1640, the first English settlers came across the Sound and they established the first English speaking colony in Southampton. Okay. Richard Smith had left England. He was floating around in the Caribbean. He wound up in the colony of Southampton, where actually I grew up, but not with Richard Smith. And he became a respectable member of the community of Southampton Colony. He married, and they started having a family. He returned to England to visit his ailing parents, and on the way back to the Massachusetts Bay Colony, he associated himself with 10 men who were Quakers. And so during the whole transport, he maintained contact with them, and he learned about being a Quaker. But when they landed in Massachusetts Bay Colony, they found that religious tolerance extended so far, but it did not extend to Quakers. And so the Quakers were told they were denied entry, and they had to go back to England. And by association, they said, Richard Smith, you're a Quaker. And he says, no, I'm not a Quaker. I'm a respected member of the colony in Southampton. And it took 3 weeks for them to vouch that he was, in fact, what he said, a regular member of the colony in Southampton. Well, a few years later, Richard Smith was banished, exiled from the colony of Southampton. And he and his wife and their 9 children at the time were kicked out, and they moved to Setauket. They were there for 6 or 9 years, and then they moved to the mouth of the Nisququag River Road and Moriches Road, where there's a monument down there now commemorating their location. But why was he banished? Well, it turns out that he was painted with the color of being a Quaker, and some of his actions were akin to Quakers and in opposition to the Puritans of Southampton. For instance, he considered, and he would talk, that women and men were equal. Well, that was revolutionary back then. And he also failed to doff his hat to the local magistrates, which was the custom and the anticipated practice, because in Quaker tradition, one did not show deference to civil authority. You're all equal. So, based on that, I want to find the exact verbiage. Oh, yes. I once spoke to the Southampton town historian, Bob Keene, who informed me that there was just one line in the annals of Southampton Colony for the reasons of Richard Smith being banished. And it was for unreverent carriage towards the magistrates, quote unquote, unreverent carriage towards the magistrates. In other words, not showing them deference, not showing them that they were above everybody else. And for that, he and his family were told to leave. Quite remarkable. So, where did our faith community, which we now call the Presbyterian Church, come from? And how did it wind up on this corner in the center of Smithtown? It's very timely to ask that question because as we celebrate our 200th anniversary and our 350th anniversary here, the first church, or meeting house it was called, they weren't really called churches back then, was established by Richard Smith, basically for his extended family down at River Road. The building was very small, very rudimentary. There's a caricature of an outline of what it looked like. Rough-hewn wood, no insulation, no windows, no heat. But that was their meeting house for purposes of meeting of the inhabitants as well as worship services. There was no called minister there. Nobody could afford that. And ministers would travel from church to church, most notably from Setauket, Brookhaven, and Islip. would make a circuit. I'm not sure whether they actually always had services on Sabbath, on Sunday, or whether it was other days due to the availability of ministers. But so that was founded in 1675, which was 10 years after Richard Smith established the settlement down there. I've been asked to give this whirlwind tour of our history. I've drawn my information from 3 sources. From Brad Harris, who was a town historian for years and wrote several articles, well, many articles actually, about our church's role in Smithtown's history. There are 2 newspaper articles, very informative, out on the first windowsill when you came down. I encourage you to read those. And Noel Gish wrote a book about Smithtown. A copy of that is out in the narthex. And most importantly, from what I gather, my most amount of resources is from that wonderful book, Church and Community, 1675 to 1975, that was composed by our church historian, Dick Mihalik. It's just a wonderful book, and I don't know how long it took him to compile it, but it is really remarkable. And one of the most remarkable things is a timeline. He established a timeline which is presented on all those panels in the hallway of the events of the growth of our faith community. But interspersed in that timeline are various notations about what was happening in the area around here, in the country, or even in the world. So I've marked those with red stars to draw your attention to the fact that when there was a faith community here, George Washington hadn't even been born yet. Handel had not composed the Messiah. This is all these little ditties are interspersed in that timeline, which really places us in the history of the world, really, if you will, because it's just not, we were born in 1675, and now it's 2025, and so we can celebrate 350 years. Well, it's like the dot on a cemetery plot with the date of birth and the date of death, and that little dot is a person's life. And that book highlights, this was our life all these years, but there's no death date on it because we're a living community of faith here. Also, our church website, which should be on one of the pieces of paper that you were handed when you came in. You can download and read the entire book on that website, and also there was a subsequent edition authored by Pastor Emeritus William Edwards, entitled Church and Community, the next chapter, Prelude to the Fourth 100 Years. That was written by Bill and church historian Sue Nunziata, and the updated timeline was compiled by Elizabeth Ewing and Virginia Newcomb, who are still with us, of course. I will limit this talk to the period of time from the founding of the settlement in 1665 to the construction of our present sanctuary in 1825. We just recently ordered new copies of the Church and Community book. It replaced the original one, but it's the same book. It has photographs. It has, you'll see that everything that I'm telling you and much more is in this book, and said much more succinctly than I can. But it's a wonderful read. There'll be copies of it in each of the libraries, and as I say, it's available online or for purchase today out there. So the early church was also the meeting house of the settlement, or rather I should say that the meeting house was also the church, as it served both purposes. by nature, this was what was called a congregational church. It was not a Presbyterian church. The Presbytery had not even been formed yet. But in reaction to the King of England and the Church of England and the hierarchy of the church in England, just like the Pilgrims came to avoid that or to escape that, they came here with a desire for freedom of religion, and that was interpreted as freedom from the hierarchy. We don't have a bishop. The original Congregationalists just governed their own church the way they wanted to. They did have the benefit of educated pastors coming in. Most of them graduated from Harvard or from Princeton at that time, who would travel around. But they governed themselves, much like later when the Presbyterians came about. Well, I'll get to that in a minute, in 1650. But originally, congregations in New England were Congregationalists. I get ahead of myself. Can't keep up with my notes here. First Presbytery was organized in Philadelphia in 1706, and the Suffolk Presbytery would be formed 11 years later in 1717, comprising the churches of Jamaica, Newtown, Southampton, and Setauket. Our church in Smithtown chose not to join and remained a congregational church back then. The first minister to be called and to be an actual residence here was Daniel Taylor, age 28, in 1712. Now, keeping in mind, these little settlements did not have the funds to pay for a full-time pastor. The typical compensation back then was some food, some land perhaps, and cordwood to keep them warm, to burn in the wintertime. That was their compensation initially. Yeah, as I mentioned before, in that very rudimentary building, services were reverent, accommodations were simple, and the space was cold. Services could be in excess of 2 hours sitting there in the cold. And it would be 7 years before Ben Franklin would invent his first room heating wood-burning stove. The year was 1675. It would be another 67 years before Handel would compose his Messiah. So now, from 1675 to 1750, what happened? Well, the center of commerce became at this intersection of this road. You had Middle Country Road, which came out from Brooklyn, a two-day stagecoach wagon trip out here, continuing on Middle Country Road out east. You had Hop Hog Road coming up here, meeting up, and at that time it didn't come all the way to the intersection. It turned left and came around Singer Lane and cut diagonally across within 10 feet of our front door here, what would become our front door. So in 1750, because this was a center of development, new development, and of commerce, the congregation down on River Road said, we should move up here. And it was a contentious debate. The old-timers said, no, it's good enough for my father, it's good enough for me, I want to stay here. And by a very narrow vote of 2 votes, it was passed to relocate the meeting house. And when I say meeting house, they took it apart by beam, plank by plank, and moved it up here. But before they could move it up here, they had to have space. Where were they going to put it? How were they going to pay for it? Well, that was answered by Obadiah Smith and Epenetus Smith. And they donated the land here for the purpose of having that meeting house moved up here. And I think one of the most significant artifacts that we have here is the bronze plaque which is outside behind me in the vestibule. And on that plaque, it states part of the quotation from the original deed in 1750. And it states the purpose of why Epaenetus and Obadiah were doing it. Now, if I read, to be appropriated for the sacred use of building a house upon for the public worship of God in a Presbyterian dissenting form forever. So it's clear that Obadiah and Epaenetus wanted this land that they were donating for the purposeful Presbyterian dissenting form forever. I think that's a real, well, that's one of the gems that we have here as far as the artifacts that we have. And the other that I think is very significant is the list of all the ministers on a plaque outside in the narthex here with their dates of service here. And out of those 350 years, we've had 34 called ministers. And Pastor Karen Crawford is our 34th. So if you do the average is about 10, but some were 40 years, some were, Bill Edwards was 25, Jimmy Halsey, the most recent one before Pastor Crawford, was 17 years. So we're very fortunate and blessed that when the call that the congregation extends is honored by not only the congregation, but also by the called minister. The population in 1775, oh, I'm getting ahead of myself. So they moved the same building that was down there, they moved up here in 1750, okay, which is a few years before the American Revolution, putting that in perspective. The population in 1755 was 716 people. 387 were over the age of 16, and 329 were under the age of 16. Families were large back then. Why? Because they needed kids to help them. Well, because they loved the kids, but they needed kids to help them on the farm. We're no different here than they were all over the country. And looking at the records, I saw that, which surprised me, most landowners, large landowners at the time, owned between 1 and 6 slaves. Now this was 1755, and the census showed that there were 90 slaves in Smithtown alone, and 1,400 in what was then what would become Suffolk County. So 1755, Dick noted in his timeline, that would be 10 years before Napoleon was born. Again, where did we fit in the continuum of world events? 1774, the same year as the Boston Tea Party, the Reverend Joshua Hart was installed as minister here. He graduated from Princeton. He was ordained an evangelist. And Reverend Hart was a fiery orator, passionate in his support for the growing revolutionary cause. He would serve for 13 years. Now, imagine that old wooden building is up here on this corner. He's there's no raised pulpit, and he's giving these fiery sermons railing against the king's tyranny. By that time, the so-called Battle of Long Island had been fought. British had assumed control over Long Island, and there were British soldiers out here taking property, blankets, food, livestock for their use from the inhabitants of the colony here. Joshua Hart would be preaching against that. Needless to say, the British, and there were many, a sizable group of loyalists too to the crown who were here. They were not particularly happy having such an orator using the power of the pulpit to rail against the king and their very presence here. Joshua Hart was arrested more than once. The most notable one was he was arrested and taken to a British war prison ship in Brooklyn, where he was for 5 months. And he was deathly ill, and he was befriended and nursed back to health by Ethan Allen of the Green Mountain Boys, you recall from your history. And Ethan Allen wrote in his memoirs that he would pray side by side with Joshua Hart. After 5 months, he was released. Did he get the message? No. He got right back in the pulpit and was preaching the same rebellion against the king as he did before. And although we don't have any definitive proof, I don't think, the story goes that he was fired upon by 2 musket-wielding British soldiers while he was preaching his sermon. Whether it's true or not, it makes a good story, just like Richard Smith riding the bull around Southampton, but around Smithtown. Joshua Hart was a minister here until 1784, I think it was. So after the Revolution was finished, but he was not here when George Washington made his trip up to Setauket in 1790 to thank the spy ring from the Setauket group that aided him during his troops during the Revolution. During the British occupation, right before they left, what happened as a farewell gift to the community, the British general basically took the meeting house apart. He removed 6,600 linear feet of wood from that old meeting house, which was basically took everything to the floor, took some of the interior, left the exterior, and then there were outbuildings as well. He took that lumber as well. So basically he stripped the church of what it had. So that would be in 1780. So that was what was left. Needless to say, the congregation was dispirited economically dispirited because they lost so much during the war. And it was a difficult time for the church. There was little financial support for the church. There were no ministers and residents, and very few even traveled around at the time. The pulpit was supplied by temporary clergy once in a while. The parsonage and the farm, which were rented out for income, and the trustees, in an effort to raise money, started the practice of renting out the pews and boxes. Evidences for this can be found on a rental chart, which is in the vestibule here, which has an outline of all the pews. Actually, I'm getting ahead of myself because we haven't built this yet. But when they did build this, they have a diagram there that shows that for all the pews and all the boxes, there was a certain amount of fee, an annual fee that people were expected to pay. And that was to raise money, obviously. Okay, it's interesting later on when people didn't pay and the trustees were saying, hey, listen, people are not honoring their pledge, they threatened to take all the delinquent pledgers and post them publicly and take them before the justice of the peace for collection of their pledge money. Needless to say, most people saddled up the money. They didn't want to be exposed to that public ridicule of not honoring their pledges. We haven't gotten to that point yet, fortunately. Well, maybe unfortunately. Okay, so it was a difficult time back then. They were so bad in 1797, membership was down to only 19 people. They still had that old building, and a committee was formed with the Long Island Presbytery, which had developed, to assist the congregation in reorganizing. The benefit of the presbytery at that time, as opposed to the congregational church, which just stood independently, the presbyteries was an organization which gave support to the individual congregations. So they just weren't out there by their own. They had an association with the presbytery. Presbytery knew about pulpit supply and support as well, and they lent that support to this congregation back then. That year, 1797, the Reverend Luther Gleason was installed as a minister. He also served a church in Babylon. Gleason's ministry began with promise, but ended in disgrace. It appears that the Reverend Gleason engaged in real estate speculation and other personal practices of questionable moral propriety, which ultimately led to his impeachment by the presbytery in 1807, after serving 10 years. His stated impeachment was for practices unbecoming his sacred office. Well, that caused a division in the congregation. The Congregationalists liked Reverend Gleason, and others did not. And so that led to this division. Again, we haven't formed this new church yet, this new building yet in 1825. But that further weakened this congregation. Dick mentions that in this time, in 1802, the first schoolhouse in Smithtown was built on the lot right on the other side of our driveway here. And the instruction of that small one-bedroom schoolhouse was later provided in 1837 by educator and poet Walt Whitman, who taught there. And that original building is still here, although it's been covered over, and it's next to the old dairy barn right here on Singer Lane. I'm not sure what it is now, but that building is there, and unfortunately it's not preserved or really, I think there's a little plaque on it. But that was where Walt Whitman taught. Later on, the church acquired that property. Also at that time, there was disagreement about the unregulated use of the meeting house sanctuary by outside groups. Because for a period of time, when I said meeting house, that's what it was. Not just for the church, or the faith community, but for anyone in the community that wanted to have a meeting. And so it got that disagreement as to who and how the property, how the meeting house was being used, grew to a head to the point in 1810 when the trustees resolved that no one was permitted to enter without prior permission. 3 years later, the clouds of dissension started to lift. In 1813, the church was incorporated. 1813 was incorporated as the First Presbyterian Church of Smithtown. And the Reverend Henry Fuller was installed as the minister, and in his first sermon, he urged the divergent factions to remain together in Christian unity. 2 years later, so that'd be 1815, we're getting close to when we're going to be here in 1825. 2 years later, the congregation came together and started its first formal Sunday school, and soon a ministerial fund was created with pledges to create a trust of £1,000, the interest of which was to ensure the funding of ministers' salary. Unfortunately, this is when those pledges were not honored. In 1820, the trustees voted to turn unpaid pledges over to the Justice of the Peace. Despite this rocky road post-revolution, the angel of our church, we say, watched over this congregation and was very much alive and at work among its members here. In 1823, following this earlier period of dissension, the membership totaled only 32 people. So what did these 32 faithful people do? In 1823, they voted to build a new church. And build it they did. The trustees had $1,410 on hand, and the faith that if they built it, the people would come. A veritable church of dreams. Thank you, Kevin Costner. The old meeting house was auctioned off, and architect builder George Curtis was hired to design and build the new church, which proudly stands here today and where you sit. Some of the pew cushions they sit on still have horsehair in them. Okay. What are the some of the building details that you may not be aware of and might find interesting. In addition, just to the beauty of the simple architecture, the designs. There's no stained glass windows here, as was the call of many cathedrals and churches. Much lighting. The lumber was milled from trees that were felled in the front yard and taken away to the lumber yard, the mill place, and brought back here. The rafters were pre-assembled on the ground, marking with Roman numerals, and later fit together by mortise and tenon joinery with wooden pegs. So if you go up into the attic or the roof here, you can see some of the rafters. You can see the Roman numerals stamped onto these rafters that were joined together. This is in 1823 1824 that this was built. And one of the other things that I discovered, I'd never read before, but when my son was in Scouts, I was down here one day with a compass, and I brought it in here, and I put the compass on the center of the pulpit Bible, and I discovered that due north runs right down the railing which separates the two sides of the pews here. I thought that was quite remarkable. So looking out that way, that's due east and that's due west. The morning sunlight comes in here. The afternoon sunlight comes in here. I don't think that was just a coincidence. I think it was designed that way to honor the force of nature, or the belief in nature, to recognize nature's positioning of this sanctuary. We have a handout that you may have received. If not, they're out in the narthex with other features of this sanctuary. But it's a beautiful place. It's a simple place. But it's a place that's designed not for the distraction of the outside world, but for the worship of why people come here. For introspection, to hear the word, and to have it in a place that's beautiful and preserved. 1825, 1925, 2025, 200 years this building has been here. And through the dedication and the love of the congregation, it has been preserved. To conclude my presentation, I'd like to say that this is just part of our rich history, from the founding from 1675 to the transition and creation of this beautiful sanctuary in 1825, and now to 2025. We can all agree that our history is long and that our sanctuary is beautiful in its simplicity and graceful lines, but most of all, the pride of our heritage is in the hosting of the faithful who come here together in community to hear the word and to worship God in prayer and mission. I invite you to take the sometime to read the wonderful work of Dick Mihalik, summarizing our history. Read it in a chronological sequence to gain a better perspective of where we were and where the world was together. And read it to gain the understanding of challenges, diminished membership, not enough money. But remember those people, those 32 people said, you know, after the revolution, said, we're going to do something. What are we going to do? We're going to build a new church. Like, think how revolutionary that was after the revolution. Read it to discover the challenges we face today are not so different from the challenges that they faced back then. And through similar commitment and faith, those challenges can and will be met and turned into opportunities for renewal and growth. And with that commitment and faith, we too can continue God's work here today for ourselves, for our neighbors, for all God's children, and for all those who come after us in this place. Again, on behalf of our congregation, I thank you for your interest in our history, for your being here today, and as we share our community, we all are neighbors. As Will Rogers, the American humorist, once said when he traveled around the country and speaking before groups of people, he said, "There are no strangers here, only friends we haven't met yet. You're always welcome here. If you have curiosity, come to a worship service Sundays at 10 o'clock. Also, those services are live streamed on Facebook and YouTube, I think it is. I'm a digital dinosaur, but you can watch the programs then. But come here and meet the people and experience the welcome that you will receive here. So, with that said, I bid you peace be with you. Thank you.